Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
This is the State of Affairs, and I'm Akshay. So now it's beyond debate that a rule of law process in the country needs urgent reforms. So sir, when we talk about rule of law reforms, what specific elements are we talking about?
There are a whole range of issues, Akshat. Let's look at some numbers. We'll get a sense of what needs to be done. First, conceptually, what is rule of law? You require speedy and efficient justice, both criminal justice and civil justice, dispute resolution. We are doing very badly. The fact that there are 40 to 50 million cases pending in courts, it shows how terrible it is. And in some cases, they're pending for decades. Another fact which is not much discussed is that the criminal cases far outnumber civil cases in India. Actually, the ratio of civil to criminal cases is 1 to 2, or criminal to civil is 2 to 1. World over, in a modern economy, civil cases rise because economic interactions means more litigation, more disputes. Criminal cases will not rise so dramatically. So why is it that in India, the civil cases are far fewer than criminal cases? Not because there are no disputes, but because there is no faith in the justice system. Crimes, to some extent, can be concealed, but generally crimes are registered. Therefore, you cannot really reduce the number of crimes by fudging. Whereas disputes, civil disputes, unless you actually go to court, there is no official dispute. So what is happening? People are either swallowing injustice and suffering silently, or they resort into extrajudicial methods of going to a gonda or a crime lord and paying money and getting rough and ready justice through brutal methods, or they are influencing a police officer or a politician to settle disputes extrajudicially. All of these are extremely dangerous methods. Either they cause grave injustice or they lead to criminalization and might become right. So that is one element. The second element is equality before law. Not only should justice be speedy and efficient, it must be applicable equally to all sections of people, rich, poor, upper caste, lower caste, educated, uneducated, in power, out of power. And the third element is that nobody is above law, is accountability. Let's take the first two. Across the board, there are serious deficiencies. Take the total expenditure, that's one indicator, not the sole indicator, for all the rule of law instruments incurred by the country. India is lowest among all significant countries in the world. We are at 0.74% of GDP. That includes all the police forces, all the union governments, armed reserve and CRPF and other police forces, all the law courts of India, etc., etc. Whereas world over, typically 1.5 to 2% of the GDP. So that number captures a lot, the weakness of infrastructure and ability. Take another number. The number of policemen is simply not rising to keep pace with the modern times. We have about 150 all together, all kinds of policemen and women in the country. World over is about 250 plus. And our 150 includes union and state forces, and many of them cannot be really deployed except for riot control because union forces have no crime investigation role. So even that number is skewed. Take the expenditure on judiciary. We spend an incredibly low sum of 0.1% of the GDP, actually 0.09%. Civilized world spends typically about 0.35 to 0.4% of GDP. So these numbers themselves indicate to you. So if you want to break up into components, you have to focus on the police. Not only the infrastructure, obviously it's required, numbers, communication, technology, forensics. But we also require to focus on independence of crime investigation. Otherwise, you may enhance the police efficacy, but you will not enhance justice. might becomes right. There are many countries where a police chief is feared more than the president or prime minister of a country. That's not a happy situation. So you require instruments by which police are held to account, but by a mechanism independent of those in executive power. They should not be controlled by political vagaries. This party harassing that party. It's a very common complaint in India. All over the country we see that happening. So how do you create a mechanism by which investigation is autonomous, independent, impartial, and yet accountable? Not to a partisan police force, but to a partisan political control, but to a credible mechanism. The third element, apart from infrastructure and independent investigation, is prosecution. We have one of the lowest prosecutors numbers in the world. Incredibly low. Our total number of prosecutors in the country are about 8,000 to 9,000. It comes to about a 6 or so per million population. One of the lowest in the world. Not only the numbers, their capacity, and of course their independence are totally in question. Therefore, the number has to be increased, the capacity has to be enhanced, and most of all, they must be made independent. Right now, every political party appoints their favored advocates who are working with their party as prosecutors, etc. in most cases. That simply is no good. Just as police require independent and professional management, we require for the prosecution also. Then procedures. Even if everything is good, only 10 to 15% of cases end up in conviction in this country. That too years and years later, unless there is a confession often extracted by the police in respect to the poor people who are accused by third-degree methods. That is not justice. We have one of the lowest rates of conviction in the world. Therefore, procedures, not only to enhance the speed of trial in criminal cases or in case of civil jurisdiction, the speed, but also to improve the quality. There's a lot to be done. Procedural, the Evidence Act or CRPC or Civil Procedure Code, etc. And finally, the courts themselves. Again, in courts, there are two components. One is the judicial infrastructure, both human and material. Many people complain that they have court buildings without any minimal facilities, without even proper toilets. No, it's a disgraceful situation. So you must spend, you can't simply spend 0.09% of GDP on courts and then expect justice. You can't spend tons and tons of money, but you have to spend what is required to meet the situation, to meet the needs of the country. Therefore, better infrastructure, more number of judges. We only have about 14 judges per million population in India. Typically, in civilized countries with rule of law, they have 100, 150, 200 judges. We are at 1/10 of that level. So we may not go to 100, but at least 40, 50 numbers and the basic infrastructure, technology, resources, etc. But that's not enough. The quality of judges. Today, lawyers make typically multiple times the money that the judges get as salaries. Therefore, there's no incentive for competent lawyers to become judges. Unless we figure out mechanisms, to give a reasonable compensation to judges to attract the best quality, to have institutional mechanisms like Indian Judicial Service or All India Service to attract the best through an All India competition, and then allow their rise in the judiciary, etc. We have to do a lot of things, including appointment to higher courts, a mechanism by which genuine merit and competence and concern for justice, they become the criteria. Not favoritism, not nepotism, not judges' sons and nephews, not politicians' preferred candidates, but the best in the country. So a range of issues, all these are very practical. These are things done all over the world. There's nothing new. We simply are like ostriches with the head buried in the sand. We complain from time to time, but we don't address the question systematically. In the second Administrative Reforms Commission report on public order, I myself contributed a significant part of the structuring. The report is produced by the whole commission. But the sequencing of the reforms and the specifics, a lot of thought has been given. So if governments are really determined, there's an easy way of doing it. There's a sequential thing. For instance, you can have local courts. In fact, FDR looks at to have an instrument in getting a law enacted. The Gram Nyayalaya Act. Actually, I wanted it for the whole country, urban and rural. But then government said, let's do it at least for rural areas. But so far, in most states, it's not even implemented. Even when the law exists, it's a very good law. It must be expanded to urban areas also, because real challenge of litigation and crime are more in urban areas than rural, increasingly. But that apart, it's a good law, well designed. Summary procedures, simple procedures, very thoughtfully done with a lot of deliberation. But even when instruments are available, we are not willing to utilize them. So we have to actually get down to action rather than complaining all the time.
So how do you think this political will be created? Do you think we are a long way to go before that actually comes about?
No, see, you must have a step-by-step approach. If you want everything to be resolved overnight, it will not happen. So my approach would be twofold. With increasing urbanization, there is a sense that crime is getting out of control. Disputes are getting more complicated. Excessive disputes unresolved will lead to economic stagnation. If people fear that their property or their assets can be seized without due process, then they will not take any risks. And in a world of might is right, innovation and entrepreneurship will die. So I think there is an incentive. The political party should understand. The second thing is, so far in rural areas, the crime has been largely under control because of social controls. Everybody knows everybody else. So the family is a strong unit, and the fear of what the neighbor might think of you, so on and so forth. But with increasing urbanization and impersonal lives, that will not work. And if crime rises, oftentimes we keep hearing about women being molested. Our society cannot tolerate that. And there is pressure to indulge in extrajudicial encounters, extrajudicial killings. Or public pressure is there and parties are under attack, governments are under attack. So it's in the interest of the political parties to improve the quality of rule of law, in the form of law and order, peace and harmony and protection of innocent citizens, and B, dispute resolution to make sure that the economy grows. So I think there is an incentive to enlighten political leaders. Once they understand the direct incentive of votes in the form of law and order, already in some states you see a party or a government that is seen to be doing a little more to protect law and order, they are getting favored. But similarly, civil dispute resolution, etc., property rights, etc., if there's a greater awareness that economic growth depends on that, I think there's an incentive. But some of us must design things carefully and sit with the political establishment and get the change happen.
So when we talk about the reform process, how do we go about it? So is it one major swipe of overhaul, or is it homeopathic doses of reform? How do we go about that?
See, there are three broad approaches. One is the power of the context. When the public attention, political attention, media attention at a particular time is deeply engaged on an issue, that is the time to focus on a very sensible, creative answer to that problem. Take, for instance, the 2G spectrum. 2011-12, there's a lot of concern in the country about corruption or malfeasance in terms of allocation of spectrum for the mobile telephony services. Now, what FDR looks at have done is, we seize the context, the moment. We put together a team of outstanding Indians with great experience and credibility, and we went to Supreme Court and asked for cancellation of the spectrum licenses awarded in an arbitrary manner, non-transparent manner. Even if corruption is not proved, that they were given arbitrarily and non-transparently is good enough for a court. They were cancelled, 122 licenses. We asked the court to make sure that there is competitive bidding in allocation in future. The court gave that order. Since then, there is zero corruption allocation of spectrum. So, the power of the contest is used wisely by creating a mechanism that guarantees success. Your speech making or your intentions will not guarantee success. In this case, for instance, the moment it's opened up to competition and transparency, you don't have to do anything more. Just ensure that competition is there, transparency is there. The market will take care of it. Because all the people are now custodians of this reform. All the players in the system, economic players in the system, they have an incentive to be able to compete on level playing ground. So the system will take care of itself. So some are like that. Power of the context and used in the market. Some will happen only when you, like for instance, rule of law, we divide it into several components, each clear, carefully identified. All of this may not happen. Let's at least get some things done. For instance, the politicians may not be ready and willing to give up control over crime investigation. It's illegitimate control, no question about it. But they may not be willing to give up. All right, we'll see when that time comes. We can improve forensics meanwhile. You can improve the quality of prosecution, for instance. You can improve the court infrastructure. You can improve the procedures. Even in areas where there is a political resistance, you can actually break the problem into components. If you say the whole police will be out of the control of the politicians, there will be also legitimate fears. Please remember, politicians are elected by the people. Now, if there is injustice, if people come to me with grievances, if they have no role at all in acting as intermediaries and addressing those challenges, then how will the politician respond to the people? So perhaps instead of asking for all the police to be taken out of the political control, we recognize that a significant part of the police functioning is law and order. And you cannot take away politics from that because no government wants to give up control over law and order. And therefore, can we separate crime investigation from law and order? Even in crime investigation, in order to minimize the political resistance, can we say crimes above a certain level must be automatically managed professionally, independently, without any political interference? Whereas below a certain threshold, what is happening now, let it continue. Heavens are not going to fall after all for 75 years. Maybe 150 years, executive had a role, or the political executive had a role in managing the crime investigation. However wrong it is. If the minor cases that continues for some time, heavens don't fall. But at least supposing major cases, serious crimes, they were able to insulate, huge step forward. So a pragmatic approach and outcome-driven approach rather than very theoretical. Well, theory or the principle must be underlying your whole approach, but the design must be pragmatic. And finally, the power of the context. So there's no one single formula. There's no silver bullet. All over the world, these are challenges. But our experience in India shows that if you assiduously, systematically pursue it without any partisan agenda, and if you're innovative in designing solutions that satisfy the legitimate concerns of all the stakeholders, there's a greater chance of success.
Thank you so much, sir. This has been very insightful. I am Akshat, and this is the State of Affairs.